The plane was filled with the usual buzz of passengers finding their seats, storing away luggage, and settling in for the journey ahead. The air was heavy with the scent of jet fuel and the faint aroma of recycled air, a familiar smell to those who traveled often. In the midst of this routine, one man walked confidently down the aisle, holding a boarding pass that clearly marked his place in the front of the plane, the VIP section reserved for those who had paid for the luxury and comfort of first-class travel. He carried himself with quiet dignity, his posture upright, his expression calm, though his eyes revealed a weariness that came from years of being scrutinized in spaces where he rightfully belonged. He reached his seat, a plush leather chair that stood out starkly from the cramped rows behind him, and placed his bag neatly in the overhead compartment. As he settled into his seat, some passengers barely noticed, but others cast subtle, lingering glances. His dark skin seemed to speak louder to them than the boarding pass in his hand. The murmurs began quietly, almost like whispers carried by the air vents, but soon they grew louder, laced with curiosity and disbelief. A flight attendant approached, her smile tight and forced, the kind of smile that held no warmth, only a hint of suspicion. She leaned in, speaking in a voice that tried to sound polite but carried an unmistakable edge. "Sir, I think you might be in the wrong seat," she said, gesturing toward the rows further back. He looked up, calm and collected, and without a word, handed her his ticket. She glanced at it quickly, her face tightening for just a moment before she composed herself again. Instead of offering an apology, she pressed on. "I'll need to double-check this," she said, her tone sharper now, as though his presence in that seat was an inconvenience she wasn't prepared to accept. Passengers nearby watched intently, their eyes shifting between the man and the attendant, some with raised brows, others with smirks that betrayed a sense of agreement with her actions. The attendant walked briskly toward the front, her heels clicking against the floor, leaving the man sitting there with an air of quiet defiance. He adjusted his jacket, exhaled slowly, and waited. Minutes later, another crew member returned with her, this one a supervisor with a practiced air of authority. Together, they stood over him, creating a barrier of doubt and hostility. The supervisor's voice was firm, lacking even the pretense of politeness. "Sir, this seat is reserved. We'll need you to move." The murmurs grew louder now. Some passengers leaned in, eager to see the unfolding drama. Others shook their heads, convinced that the man was overstepping. The supervisor extended a hand, as though waiting for him to gather his belongings and comply. But the man remained seated, his gaze steady, his voice calm yet unwavering. "This is my seat," he said softly, but with a weight that carried through the cabin. He held up his boarding pass again, placing it in their line of sight, a silent reminder of his right to be exactly where he was. The tension in the air thickened. What should have been a straightforward acknowledgement of error turned into a spectacle of resistance. The staff exchanged glances, their discomfort growing, but instead of conceding, they doubled down. "Sir, if you don't comply, we'll have no choice but to remove you from the flight," the supervisor declared, her words sharp enough to cut through the whispers. A gasp rippled through the nearby passengers. Some pulled out their phones, sensing that this was a moment worth recording, a confrontation that revealed more than just a seating dispute. Still, he did not move. His presence alone was an act of defiance against the unspoken rule that some seats, some spaces, were not meant for people like him. Every second he sat there was a challenge to the prejudice staring him in the face. The humiliation wasn't just in the words spoken to him, but in the way dozens of eyes pierced his dignity, questioning his right to comfort, to respect, to equality. The attendants stood taller, clinging to their authority, unwilling to admit that their judgment was rooted not in policy, but in bias. The scene was no longer about a seat, it was about power, perception, and the audacity to strip a man of his rightful place simply because of the color of his skin. The weight of that moment did not end with the confrontation in the aisle. It lingered, heavy and suffocating, as if the very air in the cabin carried centuries of history within it. The humiliation was not new, it was a familiar script written into the lives of countless individuals who bore the mark of systemic racism in spaces where their presence was doubted, challenged, or erased. For the man sitting in that VIP seat, the sting of being told he did not belong was sharper because it echoed a truth he had carried for years, that no matter how successful, no matter how accomplished, there were always those who would see only the color of his skin before they saw his humanity. The whispers around him carried layers of prejudice that had long been normalized. Passengers muttered things under their breath, their voices dipped in a mix of skepticism and disdain. To them, his dignity was invisible, his achievements erased in an instant by the narrative society had crafted, that luxury was not meant for people who looked like him. The glances he caught from the side spoke louder than words, eyes narrowing, lips curling, silent judgments that suggested he was an intruder in a space supposedly reserved for others. Each glance carried the unspoken question, how did he get here? The pain of systemic racism lies not only in the direct insult but also in the layers of subtle, daily reminders that one's worth is constantly under scrutiny. Airports, hotels, boardrooms, restaurants, spaces that should be defined by service, merit, or access are too often transformed into battlegrounds for dignity. And in that cabin, what unfolded was not an isolated mistake by one or two employees, but a reflection of a system that had conditioned them to assume he could not possibly belong in the seat he purchased. It was not about policies, it was about perception, and perception, when fueled by bias, becomes its own ruthless form of injustice. For him, the confrontation became a mirror of countless moments from his past. Times when he had been followed through luxury stores, his steps shadowed by suspicious clerks. Times when he had extended his hand in professional settings, only to be mistaken for someone in a lesser role. Times when excellence had not been enough to shield him from the sting of being underestimated, dismissed, or excluded. Every look, every doubt, every act of subtle aggression formed a heavy chain that he carried silently, a chain that rattled loudly in moments like this. The passengers around him were not just bystanders. They became participants in the unspoken drama of race and power. Some smirked, their faces betraying a quiet satisfaction that the staff were putting him in his place. Others avoided eye contact altogether, unwilling to confront the injustice unraveling before them, retreating into the safety of silence. A few shifted uncomfortably, torn between their conscience and their fear of standing out, but even their hesitation became part of the larger silence that allowed discrimination to thrive. The man, however, understood this silence well. It was the silence of a society that often prided itself on progress but stumbled when faced with the raw reality of prejudice. It was the silence of those who benefited from privilege, who could afford to look away, who would never understand what it meant to be questioned in spaces they moved through freely. For him, silence had always been a companion in the face of bias, but in this moment, it pressed down harder, reminding him that respect, for some, was conditional. The systemic weight of racism is not only about exclusion, it is about erasure. To be told, either through words or actions, that your place has to be justified, that your legitimacy must always be proven, that your existence in spaces of privilege is an exception rather than a norm. That is the deeper cut, the one that bleeds long after the words have been spoken. In that cabin, the man was not only fighting for his seat, he was fighting against an entire history that told him he should not be there at all. And yet, as he sat there, he embodied resilience. His calm refusal to surrender that seat was more than defiance, it was a reclaiming of space, a declaration that his worth was not up for debate. He knew that the system thrived on silence, on compliance, on quiet exits that left no disruption. But every second he remained, every breath he took in that chair, became a disruption of its own, a statement that the narrative others tried to write for him was not one he would accept. His very presence, dignified and unyielding, became an act of resistance against a system designed to erase him. The confrontation could have escalated into anger, into raised voices and heated words that might have confirmed the very stereotypes the attendants carried in their minds. But instead, he chose a path that carried more weight than rage could ever deliver. Sitting there in the first-class seat, with dozens of eyes fixed on him, he adjusted his posture and let silence be his shield for a moment. His calmness was not weakness, it was power contained, a deliberate refusal to let the ugliness of discrimination drag him into the chaos it sought to create. When he finally spoke, his words were measured, his tone steady. He did not shout, he did not beg, he did not attempt to explain away his right to be there as though it required justification. Instead, he presented the facts with quiet authority, placing his boarding pass in clear view, reminding them that no amount of doubt or suspicion could erase what was written there. Every word was laced with restraint, but beneath that restraint was a depth of strength that unsettled those who tried to challenge him. The flight attendants had expected resistance laced with hostility, something they could use to validate their decision to confront him. Instead, they were met with composure that could not be twisted, dignity that could not be undermined. His calm was disarming, a mirror reflecting their own behavior back at them, making their prejudice harder to mask beneath professional language and false authority. With every unshaken response he gave, he made it clear that the real issue at play was not his boarding pass, it was the assumptions they carried within them. Around him, the passengers shifted uneasily in their seats. Some expected drama, an argument loud enough to fill the cabin, but what they witnessed instead was a man who refused to surrender his dignity to anyone else's ignorance. The restraint in his voice contrasted sharply with the sharpness in the staff's tone, creating a scene where the imbalance of respect became painfully obvious. He was not only defending his seat, he was demonstrating what it meant to rise above the bait of humiliation. The strength in his calmness was more than just for himself. It carried a message for every person watching, whether they realized it or not. It said that dignity cannot be stripped away by raised voices or false authority. It said that silence, when chosen deliberately, could be more powerful than the loudest protest. And it said that sometimes the most profound act of resistance is not in matching hostility with hostility, but in showing the contrast between justice and injustice through composure. His calm response also forced the attendants into an uncomfortable position. The louder they insisted, the firmer he became, not in volume but in presence. Each word they spoke only made their bias more visible to those around them, while his measured replies shone brighter against the backdrop of their hostility. They wanted to move him, to erase him from the space he had earned, but with every second that passed, it became harder for them to justify their actions. The power dynamic they thought they controlled began to shift, not because he overpowered them, but because he would not give them the reaction they were prepared for. Inside him, however, there was a storm he did not show. The humiliation cut deep, the weight of being singled out once again pressing down on him with familiar heaviness. But he had long learned the art of holding his pain quietly, of not allowing others the satisfaction of seeing him break under their prejudice. His response was not only about protecting his seat but about protecting himself from the deeper wound of losing control in a world that was constantly testing his right to exist in dignity. The people watching began to feel that weight too. Some shifted uncomfortably, realizing that the scene unfolding before them was not just about a seat but about justice and injustice playing out in real time. A few passengers lowered their eyes, ashamed of their earlier assumptions, while others stared with a growing sense of admiration for the man's ability to remain calm under such scrutiny. His composure became a lesson, not spoken directly, but written in the air for all to see, that sometimes, the most powerful response to discrimination is to rise above it with dignity that cannot be shaken. The attendants, caught in the glare of so many witnesses, struggled to maintain their authority. They repeated their words, trying to cloak them in professionalism, but their urgency revealed itself more with every attempt. And still, he sat, not raising his voice, not lowering his dignity. He let his silence speak, let his presence hold its ground, let his calmness draw a line in the sand that prejudice could not cross. He became an example of resistance not through defiance alone, but through the quiet strength that came from knowing his worth was not up for debate. The moment of realization crept in slowly, almost imperceptibly, like a shadow spreading across the cabin. At first, the airline staff clung to their authority, holding on to the belief that they were enforcing order and procedure. But then, as the man calmly held his ground, as his ticket remained unshaken proof in his hand, fragments of doubt began to pierce through their certainty. The murmurs among the passengers shifted from whispers of skepticism to quiet gasps of recognition. Someone leaned forward, eyes narrowing as though trying to place his face, their expression changing from casual indifference to startled awareness. Another passenger whispered his name aloud, and the sound carried through the cabin like a spark catching fire. It was not just a name, it was a revelation. The man they had tried to dismiss, the man they had assumed did not belong in that seat, was no ordinary traveler. He was a leader, a figure whose influence stretched beyond the walls of that airplane, someone whose accomplishments had shaped industries, opened doors for others, and commanded respect in rooms far more powerful than the confines of this cabin. The recognition spread quickly, moving from row to row, until the entire section seemed to buzz with the weight of who he truly was. The flight attendants froze, their expressions stiffening as the reality settled in. The very man they had attempted to humiliate was someone whose name carried gravity, whose presence in the first-class seat was not only justified but celebrated in many circles. Their authority, once so confidently wielded, began to crumble under the truth that stood before them. The supervisor's voice faltered, her confidence slipping away as she struggled to reconcile the image she had painted in her mind with the reality that now stared back at her. For the man, this moment was not one of triumph but of painful irony. His identity was finally being acknowledged, but not because of his humanity, not because of his right as a paying passenger, but because of the titles and accolades attached to his name. The same people who had doubted his worthiness moments ago now shifted their demeanor, their tone softening, their posture adjusting, scrambling to undo the harm with forced politeness. It was a reminder that respect, in the eyes of many, was conditional, granted not freely to every human being, but reserved for those who had earned it in ways deemed acceptable by society. The passengers, too, changed their behavior. Where some had smirked earlier, they now looked ashamed, their eyes darting away as if hoping to erase their silent complicity. Others leaned in with newfound admiration, eager to associate themselves with the man they had just seen dismissed. The hypocrisy of it all was not lost on him. It was as though his very existence had to be validated by his achievements before it could be accepted. His boarding pass should have been enough, his dignity should have been enough, but instead it took the revelation of his identity to shift the narrative. The irony was painful but familiar. In boardrooms, he had seen the same faces that doubted him transform into admiration once they realized his position. In conferences, he had witnessed doors open wider only after his name was announced on the program. On that plane, the pattern repeated itself, a reminder that prejudice did not disappear in the presence of success, it only disguised itself until it was forced to retreat. What the attendants and passengers realized in that moment was not just who he was, but how wrong they had been to judge him before knowing his name. The shift in atmosphere was almost palpable. Where there had been tension, there was now unease, a collective discomfort that settled over the crowd as they recognized the ugliness of what had just taken place. The attendants tried to recover, offering apologies laced with urgency, their voices trembling as they sought to reframe the moment as a misunderstanding. But the truth could not be undone. Everyone had seen it, how quickly assumptions had been made, how easily dignity had been dismissed, how prejudice had bared itself in plain sight. For the man, the revelation of his identity was both vindication and burden. It vindicated his right to that seat, silencing those who had doubted him, but it also burdened him with the knowledge that without his name, without his status, the outcome might have been very different. It underscored a painful reality, that equality was still fragile, that respect was still selective, that justice was often tangled in the threads of recognition and power rather than grounded in humanity itself. The realization among the staff was clear in their faces, in their sudden shift from arrogance to deference. They now looked at him not as an intruder but as someone they should have treated with respect from the beginning. But the damage was already done. What they had revealed in those few moments was more powerful than any apology. They had exposed the deep bias that lay beneath their uniforms, beneath their rehearsed professionalism, beneath the surface of polite society itself. The cabin, once filled with judgmental whispers and stares, now shifted into something altogether different. The revelation of his true identity had spread like wildfire, and with it came an uncomfortable silence. Passengers who had moments earlier looked at him with suspicion now found themselves re-evaluating their own thoughts. Some sat back in their seats, avoiding his gaze, unwilling to confront the guilt that pressed down on them. Others looked at him with wide eyes, their expressions carrying a mixture of shock, admiration, and shame. The air had changed, what was once an attempt to strip him of dignity had transformed into a powerful reckoning that forced everyone in that cabin to reflect on what they had just witnessed. The audience's reaction was layered and complex. For some, there was an immediate rush of embarrassment. They realized how quickly they had believed the worst, how easily they had accepted the narrative that the man did not belong in that seat. Their silence during the confrontation now weighed heavily on them, a quiet admission that they had chosen comfort over courage. They had watched him stand alone against the humiliation, and now, knowing who he was, they wished they had spoken up. Their regret was etched on their faces, though their lips remained sealed. For others, the revelation became a moment of admiration. They had seen how he handled the situation, not with anger, but with calm strength that commanded respect. His restraint, his measured words, and his unshakable composure resonated deeply. They began to see him not just as a passenger, but as an example of dignity under fire. Their glances toward him shifted from suspicion to something bordering on reverence, as though they were in the presence of someone who had taught them a lesson without ever raising his voice. And yet, there were still those whose reactions carried discomfort for different reasons. For them, the revelation was not a lesson in humility but an excuse to justify their earlier assumptions. They comforted themselves with the thought that his status validated his presence in that seat, refusing to confront the deeper truth, that his humanity alone should have been enough. These passengers shifted in their seats, their minds searching for ways to reconcile the bias they had revealed with the reality they now faced. They could not admit to themselves that they had been wrong, so they clung to the idea that his position explained his right to be there. The flight attendants, meanwhile, scrambled to adjust their behavior. Their sharp, dismissive tone was gone, replaced with forced politeness and hurried attempts at apology. Their words, however, rang hollow. No matter how carefully they tried to phrase their regret, the audience had seen the contrast in their demeanor. They had watched the attendants go from suspicion to hostility, and then from hostility to panic, all because of the man's identity. Their performance now only highlighted the prejudice that had fueled the confrontation in the first place. The passengers, witnessing this transformation, were left to grapple with their own complicity. They had been silent when he was being mistreated. They had watched as his dignity was stripped away in public, and only when his true identity was revealed did their perception shift. That realization settled in their minds like a weight, pressing harder with every passing second. Some passengers avoided looking at him altogether, while others studied his face, as if searching for forgiveness they had not earned. For the man, their reactions were both predictable and painful. He had seen it before, how quickly people changed their tone once they learned who he was. It was not new to him that respect was often conditional, that admiration came easier when tied to accomplishments rather than to the simple fact of being human. He understood the shame that was now flooding the cabin, but he also knew it was not about him alone. This was bigger than one man in one seat on one flight. It was about a truth that society was reluctant to confront, that prejudice often goes unnoticed until it is forced into the open. The audience's shift in perception became a kind of mirror, reflecting the broader world outside that plane. How many others had been dismissed, disrespected, or humiliated in silence simply because they lacked the titles or recognition to force others to reconsider? How many had been treated as less than in spaces they rightfully belonged to, without anyone stepping in to question the injustice? The faces in that cabin told the story clearly. People only chose to care once they realized his influence, once they recognized his worth through the lens of status. But what lingered most was the unease. The passengers knew they had witnessed something they could not easily forget. They had seen their own biases exposed, their silence revealed, their judgments laid bare. And though they sat quietly now, their minds replayed the scene over and over again. The man's calm defiance, the attendant's sharp words, the boarding pass that proved him right, and the revelation that changed everything, all of it was etched into their memory as a lesson too raw to ignore. The power of that moment did not lie only in his identity but in the reaction it evoked. The audience had been forced to confront themselves, to see how quickly respect could turn to scorn and back again. Their perception had shifted, but the shift carried with it the sting of guilt and the burden of truth. They were no longer just passengers on a flight, they had become witnesses to a story that revealed more about them than they might ever admit out loud. What lingered in the aftermath of that flight was more than a memory of humiliation or even the shocking twist of recognition. It was a lesson, heavy and undeniable, that spread across every witness in the cabin like ripples on still water. The man had not only defended his seat, he had forced everyone present to confront the deeper truth of respect, equality, and dignity. The scene, though rooted in a single act of prejudice, grew into something larger, a mirror reflecting the world beyond that airplane, a world where judgment often came before understanding, and where respect was too often conditional rather than universal. For the passengers, the incident was not something they could simply dismiss once the plane touched down. They carried it with them in their expressions, in their silence, in the way they shifted uncomfortably in their seats as they thought about what had just unfolded. They had been forced to confront the reality of how quickly dignity could be stripped from a person and how easily bias could influence perception. The greater lesson pressed upon them with quiet force, that respect must never be tied to status, wealth, or recognition, it must be tied to humanity itself. The man had shown that equality is not something to be granted when convenient, it is a right that belongs to every individual, regardless of how the world chooses to label them. His calmness in the face of humiliation, his quiet strength when surrounded by doubt, became a living testament to what dignity looks like when tested. He did not need to raise his voice or demand acknowledgement, his very refusal to surrender his place was enough to expose the fragility of prejudice and the power of resilience. For the attendants, the lesson cut even deeper. Their shift from arrogance to deference had been witnessed by an entire cabin of people. No amount of polished apology could erase the fact that they had treated him differently before they knew his identity. Their actions revealed how discrimination often operates, not openly, but through subtle assumptions, through the quiet ways people decide who belongs and who does not. And though they attempted to recover their professionalism, the truth of their bias had already been laid bare. Their discomfort was a reminder that authority carries responsibility, and that failing to treat people with dignity is not just an individual mistake, it is part of a larger system that must be challenged. For society at large, the lesson stretched beyond the walls of the aircraft. It spoke to every workplace where someone had been overlooked because of their skin color. It spoke to every restaurant where service had been withheld, every classroom where expectations were lowered, every boardroom where a voice was dismissed. The story of that man on the plane became a reflection of countless untold stories, moments of quiet humiliation that never made headlines, moments where dignity was stolen without anyone else noticing. The cabin that day was simply a stage, but the play being acted out was one that people everywhere knew far too well. The man's response, however, offered something more than just an exposure of injustice, it offered a model of resilience. By refusing to give up his seat, by choosing calm over chaos, he showed that dignity could be preserved even in the face of blatant disrespect. His composure carried a message not just for those who wronged him, but for anyone who had ever been told they did not belong. It said that worth is not dictated by others' assumptions. It said that silence can be strength, and that sometimes the most powerful statement one can make is to simply remain where they have earned the right to be. The audience of that flight walked away with more than a travel experience, they walked away with a story that would replay itself in their minds whenever they encountered injustice again. Some might never speak of it, embarrassed by their silence. Others might recount it as a cautionary tale, a reminder of how quickly bias can distort judgment. But all of them carried the imprint of that lesson, that true respect cannot be selective, that equality must not be conditional, and that dignity is not something to be negotiated. The greater lesson of that day also reached beyond those who were present. Stories like his have a way of echoing outward, touching lives that were not even in the room. People would hear of what happened, would learn of the confrontation and the revelation, and in doing so, they too would be forced to ask themselves how they might have acted. Would they have spoken up? Would they have stayed silent? Would they have judged before knowing? The power of his story lay not only in what happened on that flight but in the questions it left behind, questions that demanded reflection and, perhaps, change. In the end, what had begun as an attempt to strip him of dignity transformed into a powerful lesson for everyone who witnessed it. A lesson that reminded them that true equality is not about who a person is in terms of titles or achievements, but about the simple fact of their humanity. A lesson that revealed how quickly respect can vanish when it is built on bias, and how necessary it is to build a world where dignity is not earned but recognized as inherent. A lesson that showed how one man's refusal to be diminished could shine a light on truths that too many try to ignore.